Dr. Layman, welcome.
Great to join you.
On this health podcast, we've spoken a lot about the importance of dietary fat and eating enough fat. But what about protein? You see, if we don't get enough protein, this can cause inflammation, disease, accelerated aging, and an inability to lose weight. So, Dr. Layman, my first question: how many people watching, maybe it's men or women or even children, how many people are eating enough protein a day?
Well, based on the uh, Dietary Guidelines Committee evaluation, that's the 2025 right now, they suggested about 45% of Americans are eating below the recommended amounts. And that's, you have to kind of think that through. It's the healthy eating index that they're using for that. So that's not exactly the same as the minimum RDA. And the other thing to keep in mind is it's not a heterogeneous number. It's far more women are below the requirement than men.
Why do you think women, because I noticed this as well, um, women generally don't eat enough protein? Why do you think that is?
The it falls into two age groups. Women over 60, it's over 40% are below the RDA, and the other group is between 18 and 22. So in the older group, it's a calorie and taste issue. They happen to prefer carbs to protein, and so they eat more carbs and less protein. They also require a lot less calories. We lose the resting energy metabolism goes down about 100 calories per decade. So by the time you get to 60 to 70, you've lost 400 calories per day. So you have to get your nutrients in a lot less calories. The younger group, they're doing it for either uh, emotional, moral decisions, or they're just doing it for body appearance. They think that somehow that's better for how they're going to end up looking. So I think it's more vanity than the older population. They think that being more vegetarian is going to make them thinner.
Let's talk about the importance of protein for different aspects of the body. First, pertaining to muscle. Why is protein so important for muscle?
First thing you have to understand about protein, and this is muscle, but it's whole body. Um, the main need for protein is that we're constantly repairing and replacing proteins in our body. We have to make between 250 and 300 grams of new protein every day just to stay healthy. That means you replace essentially the equivalent of every protein in your body 4 times every year. So where you get the protein to do that's important. And then you compound that with, we know that as you get older, the efficiency of what you do that becomes more difficult. It goes down. So when you're young, when you're 25, when you're 22, eating a lower protein diet, it seems like it works pretty well for a while. But after you get sort of around 40, 35, 40, now the efficiency and the calories both start to be a problem. You can't eat as many calories, and you actually need more protein. Whether you're growing or not, growth is actually a very minor part of protein needs. Your maximum deposition of new protein during growth is maybe 5 grams per day, but you need to make 300 just to stay healthy. So that's a different way of thinking about the importance of protein. Yeah, so every protein in the body has what we call a half-life. It only lasts so long. It has a lifespan. So there are enzymes in the liver that are replaced every hour. We know that red blood cells are replaced every 30 days or so. We know that blood proteins are replaced every 12. Muscle proteins are replaced every 15 to 20 days. So, they all have, and then connective tissues like 100 days. That's why if you tear an Achilles tendon, it takes you months to recover because connective tissue has a very slow turnover. So anyway, there's this constant rate of what we call protein turnover going on. Every protein has a little different time span, but again, we have to replace the equivalent of 300 grams per day with this protein turnover concept. And we think a big part of aging is how well you do that. If you do it inefficiently, That's part of aging. That's why people who have higher protein turnover, have higher protein diets, they tend to have better skin characteristics. They have better hair. It's just part of that repair and replacement process. What we now know from the last 20 years of research is that the range that's pretty acceptable goes from that 0.8 grams per kg up to about 3 grams per kg, which is a huge amount. Most of the research shows that we kind of optimize it in the range of about 1.5 to 1.6 grams per kg, which is 0.75 grams per pound. It's this issue of protein turnover. And what my group and what we sort of became famous for is back in 1998 or so, we published the first leucine story. And so what we know is that as you get older, the quality of the protein begins to matter, and that sort of relates to quantity. So when you're young and growing, muscle protein turnover is driven by hormones. So basically, you grow, even if you have a bad diet. We know it from malnutrition in Africa and around the world. Children will grow maybe not as well, but they'll grow with really bad diets because hormones are making as a survival sort of characteristic. So now we're looking at a different part of life, and we know that once you get beyond about 30, insulin, IGF-1, growth hormone are no longer your friends. They're no longer supporting growth. Now it switches to diet quality. And it turns out that the primary signal the body has learned to recognize is the essential amino acid leucine. And it triggers a very important protein complex called mTOR, which stimulates specifically muscle protein synthesis. And that led us into issues of protein quality and meal distribution and meal timing. And so we know that there's a totally different issue with with adults, with people over 35 than there is with people under 30. Under 30, it doesn't matter when you eat your protein. It doesn't matter very much the quality of the protein. As long as you sort of have a target level, you're going to be fine. But once you cross 30, now the efficiency of how you put it all together makes a big difference in how you're going to repair or remodel your protein for healthy aging. The issue, and we've done a lot of weight loss studies, both in experimental animal models, but also in human research. And what we know is the faster you lose weight, you can only lose body fat at maybe two pounds a week. And so if you lose weight faster than that, it's going to have to come from lean tissue. In the first week of a weight loss, you can lose more, and a lot of it will come from organs, liver, gut, etc. You'll shrink some of those organs. But after a week to 10 days, then the lean body mass is going to come from muscle. So we know that in a weight loss, if you use a low protein diet and you also you're sedentary, you're not using much exercise, you can lose 35 to 45% of your weight loss will be lean tissue, a lot of it muscle. We know that if you add in protein, you have do a weight loss with higher protein, it blunts that loss. You'll spare it. You might go from 35% being muscle to 25% just by having a higher protein diet. And then if you add in resistance exercise, you can probably get it down below 10%. So those are the two factors. And what we know is if you lose a lot of lean mass, your resting energy metabolism is going to go down. So you're not as able to burn calories when you get to your weight loss, and you're much more likely to regain the weight. So we want to protect muscle and your organs and your lean mass as much as we can while you're losing weight. And that becomes really important with the drugs and things right now, which are generating some really fast weight losses. So I would hope any physician who's recommending one of the the GLP-1 agonist type drugs is recommending both exercise and a higher protein diet. I think it's malpractice if they're not doing that.
Protein is so important for healing the inflammation and reversing chronic disease. How does protein help with that?
One, just at a 10,000 foot level, we know that your ability as you get older to avoid falls, 300,000 hip fractures in the United States per year. 1/3 of those people never leave the hospital. So just your functional mobility, your strength is a big aspect of it. Your overall health, I mean, your intestinal tract, all of your organs, all of those things have high protein turnover. So you're trying to, sustain those. A lot of the immune system requires protein turnover, your antibodies and all of that. I think one of the futures of protein research is we need to understand amino acids. And for example, sulfur amino acids, methionine and cysteine, are the direct precursors to glutathione and taurine, which are major anti-inflammatory agents. Glutathione is considered probably the leading anti-inflammatory agent in the body, very important in cancer, etc. So, you know, it's a global issue of total protein for the whole aspect of antibodies and protein that we need for immunity, but it's also specific relative to specific amino acids. And that's actually an area I'm very interested in right now, is that we don't actually have enough information about the role of individual amino acids. We mentioned leucine a bit ago, which we've studied a lot, and my group has studied a lot, but we need a lot more knowledge about threonine and cysteine and phenylalanine, and you can go on down the list. And I think those are all going to be important in aging. And I think, at least in the United States, I think internationally, it's going to be more and more important with this sort of narrative about plant-based diets. If you continue down that route, you will get to the point where you're going to become deficient in these essential amino acids. And right now, we don't even know what those deficiencies would look like. Are they going to be Alzheimer's because of neurotransmitters? Are they going to be gut health because of mucin production is down? Are they going to be inflammation because of the sulfur amino acids? Is it going to be muscle mass? Because we don't know. We have no idea what we're looking for, yet we're mindlessly wandering down this path. I always forget the number. There's, 10,000 plus enzymes, proteins in the body, and every one of those is some combination of the 20 amino acids. There are 20 naturally occurring amino acids. And sort of like, Lego building blocks, we fit those together to make these different proteins. And that's really what your genetic code is. That's what your DNA is. Your DNA provides the blueprint for every one of these proteins in the body, and it tells us how to assemble the amino acids. So, one of the things I like to tell people is, we really actually have no dietary requirement for protein. Protein is like taking a vitamin pill. We don't discuss the color or the shape of the pill. We only talk about the 14 vitamins inside of it. Protein is nothing more than a vitamin pill providing 20 amino acids. And 9 of those we consider essential or indispensable because the body can't make it. If you have enough of the 9, you can actually make the other 11. They're called dispensable or non-essential because we can make them. So we actually have a requirement for 9 essential amino acids and not really protein. And as I was saying before, we don't really know enough about the 9 essential amino acids. And I think the requirements are currently set way too low. If you look in the body, just the composition of protein in our bodies, essential amino acids make up about 50 to 55% of the proteins in your body. But if you look at the requirements, it only makes up 25% of the requirement. So there's a real disconnect there between what we currently think the requirements are and how in the world does the body make 50% out of it when we only eat 25%. So I think the RDAs for the amino acids are extremely low. And I think that's going to become a problem if we continue on this pathway of eating more plant-based proteins. I think plant-based diets are great. I think we all should have more broccoli in our diet. But the idea that beans are a substitute for beef is a really dumb idea. The beans are a great substitute for French fries, but not for beef. I was studying chemistry, and I realized that I wasn't very good in inorganic chemistry either, but I was really good at biochemistry. And so I started studying metabolic pathways, and my first research projects were in looking at protein synthesis regulation and aging. We discovered a lot of the age-related changes. The things like messenger RNAs have a very unique tail to them. We determined how that changed and how that changed the ribosomes attaching to it, how much protein you could make. So we were looking at very mechanistic things. My advisor at that time, who was, Masters Arlen Richardson, expert in aging, said, I think you really ought to get a PhD. I go, really? And he said, in fact, I know people at University of Minnesota who are doing this kind of work, and I think you should go there. I said, okay. So I did. And they happened to be in nutrition. And part of the group was experts in muscle and fat cell development. And so I combined my interest in biochemistry, protein turnover with nutrition and muscle health. And that's sort of how it all evolved. And I guess I became an expert in it because I've always had an intuitive understanding of where the answer was. I just see the answer before everybody else even asked the question. And that's where we got to leucine's story.
What is the answer to our poor metabolic health in the world?
Too many carbohydrates, too many grains. 80% of the plant-based grains in the world come from wheat. Wheat is the single problem with health in the world.
And how does that compare to not eating enough protein as well?
Wheat is probably the single worst protein in the world. It's deficient, it's low or deficient in 5 of the essential amino acids. And so as diets become poor, either in the U.S., a developed country because of choice, or in underdeveloped countries because of lack of choice, as the protein quality goes down, your ability to repair, recover, take care of the body goes down dramatically. So, I think that's a problem. You're in Australia. I don't know if you know Steve Simpson and David Robbenheimer. So they are famous for a theory called the protein leverage hypothesis. And basically what that says is that every person, every animal eats for a protein target. And what we did in 1980s in the United States is we adopted the food guide pyramid that said eat less protein, eat more grains. And that diluted the nutrient quality of the diet. And so to get your protein, everybody had to eat more carbs. And what we found was that the average intake in the US went up by about 350 calories. And it all came from carbohydrate-based things, breads, pastas, cereals, breaded products, etc. We were getting about the same protein, but we were have to eating 350 or more calories to get to it. I think that most adults should fall between 1.2 and 1.8 grams per kg. We typically target around the 1.5, 1.6, which does translate into 0.75 grams per pound. So we think that is a good target. And if you target that level, then the quality isn't as important. You're probably going to get enough of the essential amino acids, even if, 50 or 60% comes from plant protein. So the quality and quantity are interrelated. If you eat enough protein, the quality factor isn't as important. And the other aspect of the quality not only is the essential amino acid, but the bioavailability. Most plants, say for example, nuts and seeds, the bioavailability is only about 50%. So if you think you're eating 10 grams, you're probably only getting 5. And that's true of wheat too. So, wheat is typically around 60% bioavailable. So, it's an issue of overall quantity, overall quality, and overall bioavailability. So again, if you're up and around the 1.5, 1.6 grams per kg, you don't have to think too much about it. But if you're a vegetarian, and most vegetarians in the US fall between about 55 and 65 grams of protein, those are risks. I mean, if that much of your protein is coming from poor quality plant proteins, you're probably borderline. And if you're 25 or 30, you can probably pull that off. but a 60-year-old is going to get into real problems with that kind of a poor quality diet.
Absolutely. I wanted to mention the bioavailability of proteins. So basically, what that means is that if you eat something, not all the nutrients and the amino acids can get absorbed in the body functionally for use.
Yeah. So yeah, let me just illustrate that for your audience is that, you know, in animal-based proteins, we don't have fiber. The proteins are all available and they're all digestible. But in a plant, the proteins are there for the structure of the plant. They're not there for a human to eat them. They're there because of the plant needs them. And about 50% of those proteins in the plant are bound to fiber. We can't digest the fiber, so that means the proteins are not bioavailable to us. They're part of the plant structure, which is one of my sort of pet things is that that's one of the beauties of ruminant animals like cattle, is cattle can take those types of fibrous plant proteins and in their stomach, that ruminant stomach they can digest all of that and capture all of those amino acids and all of that protein. So we really have no other food system quite like a ruminant animal, cattle, sheep, goats, that can basically transform 60 grams of really poor quality protein into 100 grams of high quality protein. There's no other food system we can replace that with.
Okay, so you mentioned an average of 1.5 grams, 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight in kilograms. But I did put here as a gram amount, at least 100 grams a day. Women and men at least simple, right?
And that's I think really, I mean, most guys will get above that, but most women have a real struggle to get that. I think you look like you're a fairly small person. Most women have a real struggle to get to 100 grams. And we found in our weight loss studies where we were doing metabolic syndrome and weight loss, we found that women would lose all of the benefits of protein if they got much below 100. So there's kind of a 90 to 100 gram threshold. If you really are looking to get the protein benefits, you've got to get above that number.
Well, I eat 120 grams of protein a day. So
Which is about what I eat, actually.
really? Oh, wow. Okay.
So we did a lot of research with obesity. So I always get the question of what body weight to use when you're picking your protein target. Uh, in my state, since most people don't really know what their ideal body weight should be, we simply ask people, well, what's the target weight you want to get to? What do you want to weigh? And so base your protein on that. So we wanted to keep it simple. So if you're 50 pounds overweight, then base it on the target, whatever body weight. So don't base it on the overweight body weight. Base it on the target body weight.
So let's say that somebody is 200 pounds, they want to be 150 pounds. That means that they should have 150 grams of protein a day.
At a gram per pound. So that's 2.2 grams per kg. So that's a really high number. And my colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, she actually recommends that in her practice. We've always done our research more around 1.6, so a little lower. We know from a lot of research that you maximize your muscle protein synthesis, even for athletes, at about 1.8 grams per kg. So 2.2 is quite a bit above that. Is there reasons to go higher? Well, one of the reasons would be to reduce your carbohydrates. I'd rather eat protein than more carbs. So that's a reason to go higher. But going from 1.8 grams per kg to 2.2 grams will have no effect on muscle. One of the things that I've been really arguing in the professional world lately is, what does it mean to metabolize amino acids? So let's sort of back up a step. So you and I are both non-growing adults. We're not adding muscle mass. So what happens to your 120 grams of protein per day? Every gram of them have to be oxidized every day, and you get glucose at a rate of about 60% out of those amino acids. So if you're eating 120, you're going to get 70 grams of glucose out of that every day. So the equivalent of every amino acid you eat that day, if we're both in maintenance, has to be oxidized. So the concept that it spills over or becomes inefficient, those are all really totally misleading biochemistry that simply has no relevance. Do we become less efficient? Perhaps, but again, it's really a metabolic balance we're talking about, but they're all being oxidized. They're all turning into glucose.
So, if they're turning into glucose in the context of somebody having lower carbohydrates, by definition, that's maybe 100 grams of carbs a day, then someone doing a keto diet, even someone doing a carnivore diet. So, in the context of that, having 120 grams of protein a day, and there's 70 grams of that converting to glucose, is that a bad thing, or is that just a byproduct of what happens in the body?
It's what the body intends to do. If you look at the National Academy of Sciences and you look at the carbohydrate requirement, they've stayed right up front. There's no dietary requirement for carbohydrates at all. But the body has a base need for around 80, 90 grams per day for your brain and your red blood cells, your nervous system, your kidney. Protein is part of that. The unique thing about protein is that when you eat protein, the amino acids come into the body. They're actually metabolized very slowly. When you eat glucose, you have to get rid of it within 2 hours of eating it, or by definition, that's the definition of diabetes. So when you eat protein, it can take 5, 6, 7 hours to metabolize it. So while you're converting the protein into glucose, or in some cases, fatty acids, it's done incredibly slowly. And so what you'll find is a person who's on a higher protein, lower carbohydrate, they'll have a very stable fasting blood glucose all night long. They will wake up in the morning with a higher blood glucose than the person on a high carb diet because their body's making it totally consistently. And so what the difference is that the body has shifted away from a system where it relies on insulin to get rid of carbs all the time to where it's using protein to make it in a very steady, slow process. Totally different metabolism.
Even for people on a low carb keto diet, they might say, "Why is my blood sugar high in the morning?" That could explain why. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's what they call the dawn phenomenon.
Yeah. I mean, we've shown it multiple times in animal studies that, after a fast, after an overnight fast, they will always have higher blood sugar. It's one of the reasons why I see the values with carnivore diets, and they almost always have higher A1Cs. And the reason I think is that the whole concept of A1C is based on a high carb diet. And the A1C is determined by the post meal excursions. So you get these big, and what we know is the A1C with these post meal excursions is very damaging. It's diabetes. Okay. But when you switch to a carnivore diet, what you find is a lot of people will have 5.8, 6.0 A1Cs, but they have no post meal excursions. It just means it's constant. And I don't think it means the same thing. We know what A1C means on high carb diets, but there's no data about what it actually means. And I don't think it means the same thing. I don't think a 6.0 on a high carb diet means the same as a 6.0 on a carnivore diet. I think they have totally different metabolic outcomes.
Dr. Sean Baker talks about that extensively because I do have a subset of my audience that's on a carnivore diet, and there's all these different variations when it comes to what we eat and different things about blood glucose. But it's good to know that if you eat 120 grams of protein a day, it's perfectly healthy. Let's talk about protein timing. Why is that important? Protein timing.
So again, I mentioned a little bit ago, there's a very huge difference between young growing individuals and older adults. Okay. In young growing individuals, 25-year-olds or younger, there is no evidence that timing makes any difference at all. It's protein per day. So people need to get that out of their mind. If I'm under 30, it's protein per day is the big issue. Okay. However, when you get over 30, 40, whatever, we don't have a hard line on where aging starts, but we know that we've done studies with 37-year-old females, and we know this is all true in that group. So somewhere in that age. Now what we know is that every nighttime, you go into a catabolic state in muscle. And so basically, your muscles are breaking down all night long to fuel your liver and kidney and heart and things that need amino acids. There's no storage of an amino acid. So it has to come from there. And so when you wake up in that morning, you're in a fasted state, you're very catabolic. And we believe that how quickly you get out of that catabolic state is a big issue for aging. We think it's part of sarcopenia, osteoporosis. And what we know in the United States is almost everyone was or is eating 60+% of their protein at a very late meal of the day. So the average protein in the US was around 10 grams at breakfast at that first meal. So people are staying catabolic for 20, 22 hours a day and only having one meal for recovery. In adults, we know that a meal has an anabolic effect of about 2 to 2.5 hours. And so we're only getting one anabolic meal per day. So that's what Doug Patton Jones and I did. And we ran the study that basically showed meal distribution. And what we showed is that if we shifted the protein to the first meal, that with the exact same amount of protein per day, we would have a total net protein synthesis per day that was higher simply by putting it into breakfast. Unfortunately, everybody interpreted the study the way we did it as it needed to be an even distribution. And that's not actually what we were doing. What we were doing is shifting it from a late meal to a first meal. I think the first meal is the critical issue. There's not a single study that's ever been run that has identified the importance of lunch, the middle meal of the day. So the idea that that one needs to be exactly the same as the other two, nobody knows that. So when I draw the picture, if I'm giving a talk somewhere, I say, well, the first meal of the day should be 40 to 45 grams. Second meal, I don't care, 25, 30, 35, whatever. And the last meal of the day should be 55 or 60. I like the idea of sort of cycling up and down. I like one meal to sort of max the system, 60 grams. I want the first meal to be sure that it's high enough to turn on protein synthesis. And, we published that was around 30 grams, but that was with high quality protein. So that's kind of pure whey protein effect. If you want, most people in the United States have about 65% of their protein comes from animal protein, 35 from plant protein. 30 grams is a reasonable target for that. But if you go more plant protein, it may need to be 40, 45. I personally try and get 40 to 45 grams of protein in my first meal.
So, if you do the 40 to 45 grams of protein in the first meal, is that going to help with weight loss and fat loss?
So weight loss and fat loss are first and foremost calories. So you have to reduce calories. Calories do count, but they don't count the same. Okay? Age, muscle mass, physical activity, macronutrient pattern all make a difference to it. We know that putting protein into breakfast increases the thermogenic effect of that meal. That if you're with carbohydrate and fat, you'll lose about 5% of the calories as heat. With protein, you'll lose 15 to 20%. So we've done a number of weight loss studies where, in essence, we just increased the protein at breakfast. The rest of the day was kind of the same. And what we showed is with the same amount of calories, as close as we could, people who had a high carb, low protein versus higher protein, lower carb, the people with the higher protein, lower carb lost the equivalent of about 300 calories more from body fat per day, eating the same level of calories. That's a thermogenic effect. Okay, so that first can help you lose weight, and even more important, it should help you protect your lean body mass, your muscle mass while you're losing weight. So there's two particular, and it also should increase your satiety factor. So there should be at least three elements to why that first meal is important, particularly in a weight loss. Protect your muscle, increase thermogenesis, and provide more satiety.
Is there a maximum amount of protein that one can eat in a meal, like a maximum amount before the body cannot absorb it? It's too much.
So that's a great question that every trainer out there will say, "Oh, you can't handle more than 30." Um, there's many studies at 100 grams at a meal. Okay, so the issue is you have to adapt to it. So if I take somebody who's got 10 grams of protein at breakfast and I say, "Oh, I'm going to give you a meal with 75 in it," chances are their digestive system's not going to handle that. They'll probably have some serious GI disturbances from that. But if you sort of titrate it up over a week or 10 days, there doesn't really seem to be any limit to how much protein the body can use. It certainly can handle 100 grams at a meal. So, the idea of 40 or 50, um, the sort of the other issue about how to look at that is there a change in efficiency of the protein you're using? And so what we know, and becomes more important compared to weight loss versus a bodybuilder. We know that it takes about 30 grams of pretty high quality protein to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So we think that's an absolute minimum during weight loss. 35, 40. Then it becomes a calorie issue. If I go to 50 grams of protein, well, I'm adding another 40, 50 grams of 50 kcals. I'm adding more calories too. So we try to balance that. And so weight loss, we typically use around 35. We're kind of maximizing the protein with the minimum calories. The response curve in muscle is a very logarithmic type of thing that it plateaus out. So we think that the maximum effect on muscle probably is around 60 grams. So we don't think there's much benefit to eating more than 60 at a meal. So 30, 35 probably gives you 85% of your maximum effect, and the extra 15% comes from another 30 grams. Okay. If you're a maximum bodybuilder, an elite athlete, you may be perfectly happy getting 30 more grams of protein. You don't care about the calories. But if you're doing weight loss, you don't really want to do that. So, it's a diminishing return, and we think it plateaus probably around 60 grams. I don't think so one of the questions I always think about distribution. Okay, so if I have an individual who has 10 grams at breakfast, 20 grams at lunch, and 60 grams at dinner, that's 90. And I want to go to 120. Where should I put it? Absolutely no question. It goes in the first meal. I want that 10 to become 40. That's how you make the decision.
You do it. How do you get about 40 to 45 grams in the morning? Well, your first meal.
So that's always the question. People are busy. They're running out the door. So we actually develop protein shakes for that. So I was at the center of sort of the whey protein explosion. We sort of studied that, and, we make protein shakes. So I have a protein shake probably 5 days a week, so that's how I do it. And I'll get a protein shake. I actually sell a protein shake. We get a protein shake, and, I might mix it with yogurt or milk, and then I mix it with blueberries and whatever. So I get a kind of a balanced meal out of a shake. You can do it with, other typical things, eggs and dairy and things. It's important to recognize that the most nutrient dense form of protein is meats. The densest protein. So things like an egg with an ounce or two of Canadian bacon or ham or turkey or something like that, some cheese and a glass of milk is a pretty easy way to get to 35, 40 grams of protein. So, those are probably the two directions we use the most. Making some sort of a egg-based meal that has meats, a significant amount of meats in it. So, I said nobody needs a 16-ounce steak at dinner. Well, have 8 at dinner and have 8 more at breakfast, Eat it, make it cold cuts or whatever. Rewarm it. Eat it on the way out the door as finger food.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I have about 6 to 7 eggs for breakfast in the morning because I like to get my 30 to 40, but I can eat a lot. Like some people just like my sister cannot have that many eggs.
I can't either. And I was the director of research for the American Egg Board, so I can't eat that many eggs either. But it actually, for me, it helps to mix it with ham or turkey or cheese, or mix it with other flavors. I find it easier to eat. But for me to eat more than 3 eggs at a meal is a real challenge.
What is the first meal for you and for most people getting enough protein? Does timing matter of the first meal?
Again, the more stress you're under, I think the earlier it should be, the more catabolic the system. So if you're on Ozempics, I think that first meal should be as soon as you wake up. You want to get out of that catabolic state. Um, I went to the gym today. I work out, pretty regularly. My first meal today, my protein shake today was probably close to 11.
I have the same thing. I eat at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. I just find that, but I do get 120 grams of protein, get enough fat, don't really eat that many carbohydrates. It's just suitable for my lifestyle.
So that concept of time restricted. So I don't think anybody over the age of 40 should ever fast. We can talk about that. But basically, I'm okay with time restricted eating. I do that all the time. I don't really need 3 meals. It's just more calories, So if I try to limit that middle meal to 300 calories, I just don't want much. And frankly, I feel better. So, I have a first meal 10:30, 11, and I have another meal at 6:37. That's sort of my eating pattern.
So you mentioned you don't suggest people over 40 fast. So I want to ask you about OMAD, 1 meal a day. Do you think that's a good idea?
Depends on what your protein target is. If your protein target's 160 grams per day, as we just said, you max the system out at probably around 60. So that's not a very efficient use of your protein. I just don't think that's good. I think you need to spread it out, try and get more. And as I mentioned earlier, the anabolic effect of the meal in an adult is only about 2.5 hours. So why would you want to limit your protein to only 2.5 hour per day? Elite bodybuilders will actually eat 4 times a day. We know that post sleep, a fourth meal actually is beneficial for both for muscle mass and strength. So spreading it out, recognizing there's sort of a optimal range of 30 to 60 grams, I think is important to keep in mind. The other end of the spectrum is, how about a vegetarian who's only eating 60 per day? Well, they darn well better get 40 into one meal. So that means their other 2 meals, the worst of all worlds would be to them have 4 meals with 15 in each. That would be the absolute worst thing they could possibly do for body composition, which is not uncommon for vegetarian eating. Because of the high fiber bulk, they'll have lots of small meals. So they're kind of titrating in carbs, but they're totally ignoring protein. So we know that individuals who are on low protein diets really need to be sure they get 1 meal up in the 40-gram range, or they will reduce their protein synthesis and muscle mass.
And then, so what are your thoughts about prolonged fasting?
I don't think anyone over the age of 35 should ever do it. And that's basically, Doug Patton Jones developed the concept of a catabolic crisis. Uh, People always talk about aging and they sort of look at it like it's a slow curve. It's not a slow curve. It's a series of catabolic incidents. You'll break a leg. You'll get COVID. You'll be sick for a while. You're in bed rest. During bed rest, a person over 40 can lose 7-10 pounds of muscle mass in a week. And we know that they can't regain it. So that's the same thing that can happen during fasting. I don't think anybody over the age of 40 should ever fast for more than 36 hours. I think that's an absolute mass because the muscle mass you're going to lose is permanent. The whole issue of muscle-centric health metabolism is that muscle is your only flexible metabolic tissue in the body. Everything else has a set rate. That's what resting metabolic rate is. And so we know that carbohydrate, for example, your base rate, you can use 80 to 100 grams. Every gram of carbohydrate you use above that has to be used by muscle. And if it's not used by muscle, it has to be put into fat. And so we know that that threshold is around, and I used the term glucose tolerance, carbohydrate tolerance. We know that that's around 30 to 40 grams at a meal. The average American has 60 to 100 grams per meal. So where's the body doing it? Basically, muscle can use carbohydrates maybe 10 grams per hour and sort of baseline, which kind of adds up to that 130 number. Beyond that, it has to be physical activity, and the range of that goes from about 40 to 70 grams per hour. So for Americans to justify 300 grams of carbohydrates per day, they have to have 3 hours of intense exercise per day. And nobody's doing that. And that's why we have obesity. And when you have carbohydrates at that level, now what you have is excess insulin. And that's what causes insulin resistance. That's what causes fatty liver. That's what leads to the high triglycerides. And that's what leads to obesity. So it's an issue of people need to understand that carbohydrates are one of the most dangerous things inside the body. It has its own disease. It's called diabetes. And so the body controls glucose and blood sugar very tightly. But when you expose it day after day to more than it can handle, now you begin to destroy the regulations. We're continuously exposing the body to too many grain carbohydrates and sugars. Let me add one more thing to the muscle thing. One of the things people also need to recognize, there's sort of this fear of fat. Healthy muscle at rest, you and I sitting here at the moment, our muscles should be using 80% fat. Glucose is not a good fuel. You only use it when you're under stress, higher activity. If you're extremely out of shape, walking up a flight of steps will be all glucose. But for people who are in shape, you should be 80% fat. So people have this saying, "Oh, I shouldn't eat fat." Well, actually, that's what muscle wants to use. If you're healthy, that's the best fuel.
They will say that if you eat too much protein, it's going to cause cardiovascular disease like heart attacks, strokes. What do you think?
Well, there's absolutely no relationship to protein to that. That relationship is epidemiology have tried to relate red meats and things like that to cardiovascular. Um, and and we've done some research. I did some research with the American Egg Board, for example. I'll use that as an example then. If you take eggs just in the U.S., the NHANES surveys, and you look at eggs related to obesity and diabetes and heart disease, you'll see that eggs relate to all of those diseases. But if you then take out the people who only eat their eggs at fast food restaurants, if you take them out of the mix, all of a sudden eggs actually reduce obesity, reduce heart disease, reduce diabetes. So there's an issue of environment. And if you look a little closer, the people who eat all their eggs at fast food have higher body weight, they smoke more, they drink more, they have less fiber, they just go down the line. Every aspect of their health is less. And so the reality is that the red meat they had at the fast food restaurant with their French fries and the buns and the French fry, it was actually the only thing that had any nutrition value. So there's an association, of the company it keeps, and it has nothing to do with the actual protein. So in terms of
What about too much protein is bad on the kidneys?
that's a great one. We just had a protein summit here in Chicago 2 weeks ago, and that was an interesting topic. The protein researchers say that, and I agree, is total nonsense. The origins of that is that people who have kidney failure, renal failure, then you have to reduce the solutes in the diet. And protein, urea is one of those things you have to reduce because there's no way to get rid of it. So lower. But then the question is, does protein cause kidney failure? And in fact, actually, low protein diets reduce kidney function. It's not high protein. High protein diets actually increase the size of the kidney and increase the glomerular filtration rate. It actually makes the kidney more efficient. And we've done that in our studies. So the idea that protein causes kidney failure is nonsense. If you have kidney failure, then you have to think about protein. And there's an interesting ongoing debate at what point should you reduce it? How bad before? Because as soon as you reduce the kidney, reduce protein, the kidney will shrink in size and the efficiency goes down. So you'll make it worse. So there's an ongoing debate in the nephrology field as to even during renal failure, when should you do it? But anyway, bottom line is that protein is actually very important for the health of the kidney. Protein has such a high satiety value that, as I said earlier, I find that most women have an incredibly difficult time getting 100 grams per day. So the idea that they're going to eat, 1,000 calories of protein is just a ridiculous notion. Anybody can eat 300 grams of carbohydrates in a day, but very few people can eat 300 grams of protein.
And that's what you said to me. I look quite small, but I actually eat quite a lot. I eat more than other people, but then hiding, these other people eat chocolates and cookies and 300 grams of carbs, and then they're bigger than me.
I think for me, the keto, the carnivore, what makes them work is they're strategies that get the carbohydrates out of the diet. I think if you just, you go out and you say, tell people don't eat anything white. If don't eat anything with grains in it. Don't eat anything with wheat. You'll get the same effects. The issue is, how do you get the carbs under control? We find that in any case where when we get people's carbohydrates down under 140 grams per day, we'll correct almost all of the metabolic problems they have.
Interesting. And is that for sedentary people or is that for active people?
We've done it both ways. We've done it with exercise and without. So it's such an important response. We actually used it as a biomarker for diet compliance. If I take any person who's on a high carb diet, I measure their triglycerides. It could be 140 or it could be 180. It could be 130. Anywhere in the range, if I put them on a low carb diet down around 130, I'll decrease their triglycerides by 20%. And I can monitor that. If it's not staying down there, I know they're not complying with the diet. So it's actually a dietary, we used it in our research studies as a measure of diet compliance. When it's hard to tell if people are recording their meals very well, make a measure of their triglycerides and you can tell whether they're following a low-carb diet or not. I think the two mistakes is not eating enough, but definitely not getting enough in the first meal. I think the first meal is a critical change for adults to make.
So what do you think about beef, including steak, ground beef, and ribeye?
So beef, actually, all muscle foods, whether it's chicken or pork or beef or fish, the leucine content is around 9%.
Okay. So in terms of when you say 9%, how much leucine do we need per day?
We think the minimum number at a meal needs to be at least 2.5. We think that you optimize at around 3 grams at a meal. Which is interesting. We mentioned the RDAs earlier. The RDA for leucine right now is 2.9 grams per day. We think the optimum intake is 3 grams per meal. 3 times the RDA.
So that would mean around 6 to even maybe 9 grams of leucine a day. So I've put here, you mentioned the beef is great, any muscle meats like chicken, lamb, even fish. So I'll put here the amount of leucine. It's about like 2.6 grams per 100 grams or 3.5 ounces.
Typically with meats, you need around 4.5 to 5 ounces of meats to get the leucine level.
Okay, so that is a good benchmark. So if people eat about 4.5 to 5 ounces, which is in grams about 146 grams, you're going to get enough leucine and also enough protein as well.
So that's in the right range, and so someplace between 4 and 8 ounces of meats probably is the range that's functional. Okay. Interesting caveat: fish has lower protein per ounce. So, quote, gravity bearing species have denser muscles at around 7 to 8 grams of protein per ounce, where fish is about 5 to 6. So, you need at least another ounce and a half of fish. So, at 4.5, you now need 6 ounces of fish to be equal. It's one of the reasons people will eat a 6 ounce fillet of fish and a 6 ounce fillet of meats, and they say, well, I felt so much lighter. Well, they had 20% less protein in it. Liver has an enormous amount of vitamins and minerals and fatty acids in it, where muscle in general is quite a bit lower. As far as a protein source, it's not any better. But as far as a nutrient source, it's very rich. And that's the same as if you think about the color of meats. More red the meats, the more nutrient dense it is. The whiter the meats, the more anaerobic it is. So chicken breast and birds that can't fly, it's totally anaerobic. It has very few mitochondria. It has very few enzymes. Okay. Pork is sort of that way too. So red meats actually have the highest nutrient density of zinc, magnesium, selenium, B6, B12, et cetera, et cetera. And then liver, as you're suggesting, is even higher yet.
People feel so much better eating a fatty ribeye versus a chicken breast. It's just like, I need to eat more and I don't feel satisfied because of all the protein.
The fats actually make you more satisfied too, but it has a much better nutrient density profile. Yeah, so I use a whey protein shake every day. So, that I think whey is, depending on the quality of the whey you get, is around 11 to 12% leucine. So you can reach your leucine threshold with 23 grams of whey protein. So if you're really after post-workout getting a muscle effect, the best way to do it is a whey protein shake. If you want to have the lowest amount of calories at your breakfast and with the biggest effect for your muscles, a whey protein shake's the way to go. I think the point you're making is that a whey protein isolate is 97% pure, and so it has basically no other nutrients in it, where the ribeye has all of the nutrient profile. If you think about what is ribeye, well, a ribeye is the same as the muscles in your body. So everything that you need in your body is in that ribeye in a very bioavailable form. The B6 is exactly right because it's exactly what's in your body. The zinc is exactly the same. The iron's it's exactly the same. Where the whey protein has nothing there. It's just protein. And so, in fact, the protein shake we make is not a pure protein, it's a meal replacement. So we actually supplement it with a complete vitamin mineral mix, fibers, medium chain triglycerides, specific carbohydrates. So we do it as a meal replacement for that same reason. So protein shakes have their role, but kind of like what you're suggesting, under themselves, they're not complete nutrition. My website is metabolictransformation.com. And so people can buy them through that. So I actually generated Greek yogurts in the United States. I was at a meeting in 2003 in San Antonio, Texas, and I had all of the R&D people in the dairy industry sitting in 250 people in front of me. And I said, our research shows that whey protein's the absolute best protein out there. and you guys are selling crappy yogurts that have nothing but sugar in it. I said, you need to start selling Greek yogurts. And Chobani came on the market within a year. And basically, the dairy industry totally revamped itself and went to yogurts that have protein. So all of the proteins and protein shakes you see on the market now, talking 15 grams, 30 grams, that's all because of what we published. So, yeah, we know about those. One of the things that's interesting, the Greek yogurts are a bit more of a cheese type of thing. And so they're more casein than whey. And so, I like the yogurts. And so I actually take our protein powder and I mix it with Greek yogurt. And I make a blend of that. So whey protein is very rapidly digested. Casein's more slowly digested. So it gives me a little bit more of a balance of the two. We actually did some low income weight loss studies looking at protein choices when I was at the University of Illinois. And what we found was that if people actually shift to a protein-focused diet, reducing their carbs, it's actually cheaper than the junky diet they're eating. There are meat cuts that are as healthy but lower priced than a high-end ribeye. Frankly, hamburger is a perfectly legitimate protein source. Eggs and hamburger and hams and chickens. And I mean, pick and choose. I think they're all functional. I use a blend of all of them. I use cheeses, I use dairies. So we did a study like that. One of our weight loss studies we did with 45-year-old women who don't exactly think of going to the gym. They were overweight. And so what we had them do was a resistance routine that was more about stretch than lifting. And what we found was a massive effect on their body composition. So we had just 2 days a week, we had them come into our facility. They had a 10 to 12 minute yoga session with an instructor, learn how to do some yoga or Pilates. And then they had a 20-minute session on Nautilus equipment, but we told them not to put any weights on them. So they were just going through the range of motion. And it turns out that stretch is a major part of resistance exercise. One of the things people think about resistance exercise is kind of like, how much can I lift? But it's not the concentric motion, it's the eccentric motion. It's the stretch that actually has the bigger effect. Things like Pilates, things like yoga have massive effects on body composition, which, women can do those things. You can do it at home, rubber bands, things of that nature that you can do that emphasize stretch. And, I always say, well, what's the best exercise? Well, the best exercise is the one you'll do consistently and then focus on stretch. It doesn't have to be how big of a weight can I lift? It's I need to stretch. Well, I'm on Twitter at DON LAYMAN. If they really want to see us in action, I mentioned Gabrielle Lyon, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. We have a number of podcasts out there that I think are pretty informative. So people can look for those on, Apple Podcasts or YouTubes or whatever.